Pablo Tac was a Luiseño Indian, CH02, born in Mission San Luis Rey in 1822. He came from a family of 6 children, most of whom had been born at his people's rancheria, small settlement, near the mission. In 1832, Father Antonio Peyri chose Pablo and another boy to travel to Mexico City to study for the priesthood. They arrived at the College of San Fernando, where Tac lived until 1834. When Father Peyri took both boys to Spain and Rome for further education financed by the church. The older boy died in Rome, but Tac finished his education, studying humanities, philosophy and rhetoric. He took his preliminary vows in 1839, intending to return to California as a missionary, but he died before returning. While in the seminary, Tac was asked to prepare a grammatical description of the Luiseño language and a dictionary. In addition to this document, he wrote a history of his people and a description of life in the missions, the only account written by a former neophyte. This rare document gives us an interpretation of history through the eyes of a Christianized California Indian. Still, we should be cautious about relying too much on his memories of his Indian past. They are in the context of his newly found religion and his probable desire to please his European mentors. At the same time, however, some scholars have analysed the themes of resistance embedded in his narrative. Tac recalled his people's history of warfare with the Kumeyaay peoples to the south before the Spaniards arrived. They were always at war with tribes that did not speak their language. Always strife day and night, he wrote. He also described their war practices. They would surprise the enemy either when they were sleeping or when the men would kill the women, old people and children. This done, they burned the camp, fleeing to their homes. In this miserable state they lived until merciful God freed us of these miseries through Father Antonio Peyri, a Catalan, who arrived in our country in the afternoon with 7 Spanish soldiers. Tac related stories about the arrival of the first Spanish in his village and their attempts to speak to the Indian leaders. According to Tac, they were told, "What is it that you seek here? Get out of our country." Tac continued, "It was a great mercy that the Indians did not kill the Spanish when they arrived, and very admirable, because they have never wanted another people to live with them, and until those days there was always fighting." Tac remembered that the priest appointed native alcaldes, who were more proficient in Spanish. Each was given a staff of authority. At Mission San Luis Rey, there were 7 alcaldes. The priest communicated with the Indians through the alcaldes, who carried the news to their villages. The labourers at the mission were accompanied by a Spanish majordomo and the alcaldes, whose purpose was to hurry them if they are lazy, and to punish the guilty or lazy one who leaves his plough and quits the field. Regarding the priests, in the mission of San Luis Rey de Francia, the Fernandino father is like a king. He has his pages, alcaldes, majordomos, musicians, soldiers, gardens, ranchos, livestock, horses by the 1,000, cows, bulls by the 1,000, oxen, mules, asses, 12,000 lambs, 200 goats, etc. Pablo Tac died on December 13, 1841, before he could be ordained a priest. He was not yet 20 years old. His written work is the only account of California mission life written by an Indian and the first literature published by a California Indian. Tac's life story dramatizes the major changes that the Indians experienced as they encountered the Euro-American settlers. The goal of the Spanish priests and soldiers was to convert and pacify thousands of native peoples who lived near the California coast. They hoped to make the natives into loyal Spanish Catholic subjects, with the California missions at the core of the Spanish project to settle California. There were some successes, as evidenced in Tac's narrative, but by and large, the process of Hispanicization resulted in the introduction of new diseases that decimated the Indian population. However, by introducing the Spanish language, culture and political system, the Europeans added new diversity to an already heterogeneous society. The mixture of cultures would produce a resilient frontier environment that prepared California for new challenges. The Spanish Conquest and Empire. The Spaniards were the first Europeans to colonize the New World, preceding the English by more than 100 years. From their first settlements in the Caribbean islands, Hispaniola and Cuba, they soon began exploring and settling the American continents. In 1519, Hernán Cortés led an expedition of soldiers from Cuba to confirm rumors of a powerful and wealthy kingdom on the western mainland of present-day Mexico. Cortés led his men in the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. The epic adventure took 2 years and was made possible by the assistance of hundreds of thousands of Indians who resented Aztec tyranny, and by the use of new weapons, animals, such as the horse and dog, and most importantly, the new diseases brought by the Europeans, such as influenza, smallpox, and a more virulent form of syphilis. By 1521, the Spanish had established a foothold in central Mexico. Almost immediately, Cortés began sending out expeditions to find other wealthy kingdoms. The Spanish consolidation of political, religious, and military power over the former Aztecs, their vassals and outlying tribes, was rapid and quite remarkable. Within 50 years of the conquest, aided by a rapid depopulation of the Indians due to disease and mistreatment, the Spanish constructed an efficient government to exploit the labor and wealth of this land, which they called New Spain. The cultural transformation of this new colony would take hundreds of years as the Indian population continued to outnumber the Españolas. A mestizo, or mixed culture, gradually emerged with various degrees of mixture between ancient Indian and Spanish Catholic life. The complexity of New Spain's evolution in terms of racial and ethnic identity is a point that scholars are now exploring in great depth. Political control of this cauldron of subjugated people led to the creation of a complex bureaucracy controlled by the Spanish peninsulares and assisted by American-born mestizos and criollos. At the top was the Spanish king's representative, the viceroy, who was to implement the royal edicts and endless administrative decrees flowing from the Council of the Indies in Spain. Under the viceroy, the military and the church had their complex administrative organizations for the control and conversion of the Indians. The Spaniards occupied all of the positions of power. Soon, converted Indians and the children of the conquest, the mestizos of mixed Indian and Spanish descent, began to serve as lower-level administrators in the army, courts, and town councils. Given the tremendous distances involved, the size and diversity of the indigenous populations, and the relatively small Iberian-born population, the Spanish Empire in the New World was a remarkable achievement that lasted more than 300 years. Spain's exploration of the Californias. California was one of the last frontiers to be colonized by the Spanish government due to a change in the dynastic rulers in Spain and the perception of threats from other European powers. Hernán Cortés, the conqueror of the Aztecs, was an important leader in the early exploration of Baja California. His initiatives began the process of conquest that would lead to settlement. For almost 10 years while expanding the empire, Cortés labored to build ocean-going vessels on the west coast of Mexico to look for Otro Mexico, another golden kingdom, and perhaps to discover a northwest passage, a sea route around North America. In 1532, he sent 2 ships north, but they never returned. In 1533, 2 more ships left and landed on the Baja California Peninsula at La Paz, where they encountered rumors of fabulous pearl fisheries further north. Cortés set out in 1534 and named the Baja California Peninsula, which he thought to be an island, Santa Cruz. He and his men found some pearls, but mostly desert lands and inhospitable Indians. In 1539, he sent Francisco de Ulloa with 3 vessels to search for new kingdoms further north. Ulloa sailed up the Gulf of California, later renamed the Sea of Cortés, to the mouth of the Colorado River. The name California probably derives from a European adventure novel published in 1500 by the Spaniard García Ordóñez de Montalvo. His book, Las Sergas de Esplandián, The Exploits of Esplandián, tells the story of a mythical island inhabited by Amazons and ruled by Queen Calafia. Literary scholars regard this book as a justifying the triumph of Spanish imperialism. In the book, the Amazons and their queen are dark-skinned women fighting with gold weapons, the only metal available in their land. To aid in their battles, they trap and domesticate griffins, mythical dragon-like birds, and feed them male captives and their own male children. Queen Calafia, with her Amazons and griffins, appears at the siege of Constantinople and fights on the side of the Muslims. Later on, however, she converts to Christianity, marries a man, and returns with him to her native island of California. The island of Queen Calafia is described in the novel as at the right hand of the Indies. The early explorers, including Cortés, expected to find it within 10 days of sailing off the Mexican coast. Thus, the name was applied to the Baja California Peninsula. While the Spanish explored Baja California before 1540, more than 200 years passed before Alta California became a Spanish colony. It finally became known to the Western world as a result of the international rivalries of the European powers. Initially, the Spanish king hoped that exploring the western coast of the continent north of New Spain would lead to the discovery of a northwest passage. This would enable Spain to outmaneuver its rivals in trade with the Orient. In the late 16th century, the Spanish needed a suitable Pacific port to provide the valuable Manila galleons as they made their way south to Acapulco, laden with riches from the Philippines. In the 17th century, the Spanish monarchy anxiously tried to prevent other European powers from settling in the vast territories that Spain had claimed. In the east, French explorers and trappers threatened to encroach on present-day Louisiana and Texas. In the northwest, the Russians and British showed interest in expansion. As a result, the Spanish crown slowly moved to finance the exploration and settlement of its remotest frontier possessions, Texas and Alta California. Other considerations motivated the new settlement on the frontier, including the Spanish Catholic Church's desire to expand its missionizing endeavors as far north as possible. By the late 18th century, Baja California had already been colonized with missions and military outposts, called Presidios, and Alta California seemed to be the next logical step in the conquest of souls. Early maritime exploration and encounters. In 1542, an expedition led by the Portuguese navigator Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo set sail from Navidad on the northwest coast of Mexico to explore the northern territories. On September 28th, he discovered a very good harbour, which he named San Miguel because it was that saint's feast day. Anchoring near the mouth of the harbour, which was later renamed San Diego by Sebastián Vizcaíno, Cabrillo's men explored the bay with a small boat. A shore party rowed toward a group of curious Kumeyaay Indians, but they ran off as the Spanish neared land. Only 3 natives remained to inspect the strange newcomers. Cabrillo's men gave these 3 some gifts, and through hand motions, the Indians communicated that they knew of other strange men like them who had been seen inland. This news may have been related to Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's expedition into New Mexico in 1540. Cabrillo continued north, and local Gabrielino, Tongva, men met a group of sailors who went ashore at Catalina Island. The women fled to the interior. Later, the natives paddled their canoes to the Spanish ship and received beads and other manufactured items. Leaving Catalina and sailing north along the coast, Cabrillo named prominent geographical features as he went. North of Point Conception, the expedition landed at San Miguel Island, which they named Isla de la Posesión. Cabrillo had an accident and broke his arm, but despite this injury, he ordered the crew to continue north. Sailing against the current and the prevailing winds, they reached a point near San Francisco without ever discovering the entrance to this great bay, and finally had to turn back due to bad weather and Cabrillo's failing health. Cabrillo died as they reached San Miguel Island. After burying Cabrillo on the island, the sailors proceeded as far north as the present southern border of Oregon. Then, because of severe storms, they returned to their home port of Navidad, located near present-day Puerto Vallarta on the west coast of Mexico. The next European visitor to California was Francis Drake, an English pirate who was later given a royal commission and knighthood for his war against the Spanish. In 1578, Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, raided Spanish settlements in Chile and Peru and sailed up the Pacific coast so heavily laden with treasure that the ship's seams began to leak. On June 17, 1579, they were put into a harbour, probably somewhere near present-day San Francisco, and stayed 5 weeks while they repaired the ship. Drake named the area Nova Albion, or New England, because the White Cliffs reminded him of the White Cliffs of Dover in his homeland. While on land, the sailors traded with the native people, and Drake wrote brief descriptions of the Indians, who were probably the coastal Miwoks. Following Drake, captains of Manila galleons entered the bays along California's coast, seeking fresh water, food, and wood for repairs. The Spanish began their conquest of the Philippines in 1564 and immediately began sending treasure ships laden with silks and spices back to Spain via Mexico. As the galleons set sail from Manila to New Spain, they followed currents and prevailing winds, travelling north to Japan and west. The galleons struck the American coast near Mendocino and then sailed south. The first galleon to sight the California coast took 129 days to make the passage, and in the process, many of the crew died from scurvy. As regulated by the Spanish crown, a Manila galleon annually passed down the California coast for the next several hundred years. In 1595, Sebastián Rodríguez Cermeño sailed a galleon along the California coast to map it and to search for possible ports. Landing in Drake's Bay, which he named La Bahía de San Francisco, Cermeño stayed a month and travelled inland to trade with the local Miwok Indians for food and supplies. Unfortunately, his treasure ship was wrecked in a storm, and his men had to build a small launch to return down the coast to Mexico. Because of this disaster, the Spanish government forbade galleons from use in further coastal explorations. An intensification of rivalry over the Asian trade and the need to find ports for the galleons along the Pacific coast led the king to commission an exploration by Sebastián Vizcaíno, a Basque merchant in Acapulco, who had sailed on several galleons but was not a professional sailor. Vizcaíno sailed with 3 ships from Mexico in 1602 and took 4 months to reach California because he was sailing against the current and winds. He entered the bay named San Miguel by Cabrillo on November 10th, and since the name of his flagship was the San Diego de Alcalá, and this saint's feast day was on November 12th, he renamed the harbour San Diego. The expedition stayed 10 days, during which they refitted their ships, buried crew members who had died from scurvy, set up a tent church, and sent an expedition inland to scout the territory. Vizcaíno's ships continued north to Catalina Island, then to a bay he named Monterey, after the Conde de Monterey, Viceroy of Mexico. While anchored in the bay, he noted the ideal conditions for a galleon port. It had tall trees for repairs, unlike San Diego, and plenty of game and fish. His exaggerated praise of Monterey as a fine harbour later convinced the Spanish authorities that it should be the main port of a proposed colony. Vizcaíno continued north as far as Cape Mendocino, when storms and the illness of his crew convinced him to turn back. Although Vizcaíno described the potential ports he had explored in California, changes in galleon design, allowing more space for supplies, meant that the treasure ships bypassed California for the next 165 years. The first California colony. In 1769, alarmed by British and Russian interest in their northern frontier possessions, the Spanish government decided to establish permanent settlements there to secure their claims and block any claims by other powers. The energetic new administrator, the Visitor General José de Galvez, was determined to reorganize and expand the northwestern frontier by settling Alta California. He commissioned 2 land and 2 sea expeditions to converge on the harbour of San Diego. All were to be under the command of Captain Gaspar de Portola, while Father Junípero Serra was to be in charge of the founding of missions. The first contingent arrived on April 11, 1769, when the ship San Antonio, commanded by Juan Pérez, anchored in San Diego Bay. That same day, as remembered in Kumeyaay law but not noted by the Spanish, an earthquake shook the mountains, and the sun was partially eclipsed, portentous signs perhaps, that the world as they knew it was about to pass away. A few weeks later, a second ship arrived, the San Carlos, commanded by Vicente Villa. This early collection of soldiers, sailors, Indians from Baja California, priests and a doctor brought the colonists to more than 100. When they arrived, most of the sailors were sick with typhus, a debilitating disease transmitted by lice and fleas. Within the next few weeks, more than half of the men died on shore in a tent camp. On May 14th, the first overland expedition of soldiers arrived at San Diego, commanded by Captain Fernando de Rivera y Moncada. Father Juan Crespi and a contingent of Christianized Indians from the southern missions accompanied the soldiers, marching overland up the Baja California peninsula from Loreto. Soon after their arrival, the commanders decided to abandon the beach and find a more permanent settlement. Pedro Fages picked the new location, a hill overlooking the bay and the nearby river. This became the site of the first settlement in California, which eventually allied with a fortified Presidio with a temporary mission located within the walls. Finally, on July 1st, 1769, the expedition led by Captain Gaspar de Portola with Father Junipero Serra arrived. Besides a contingent of soldiers, they also brought 44 Christianized natives from Baja California. As Father Serra celebrated his first Mass under an outdoor ramada on July 16, 1769, only 126 of the 219 explorers and settlers who had arrived during the past months remained alive. Those who were left had something to celebrate. A few days before Father Serra's Mass, Portola took a group of soldiers north to establish a settlement in Monterey. The San Antonio returned to Mexico for supplies, leaving about 40 people in San Diego. The first report of a Spanish settler's encounter with the native people was written by Miguel Costanzo, an engineer and mapmaker. He described his impressions of the Indians when a Spanish expedition set out to find water. These Indians, the Kumeyaay, stopped every little while upon some height, watching our men and showing the fear which the strangers caused them by the very thing they did to hide it. They thrust one point of their bows down in the soil, and grasping it by the other end, they danced and whirled about with indescribable velocity. But, as soon as they saw our men draw near, they again withdrew themselves with the same swiftness. Finally, the Spaniards communicated their peaceful intent by burying their own weapons in the dirt and giving gifts of ribbons, glass and beads. Kumeyaay then indicated where to find good water, and the Spaniards began walking up the San Diego River Valley. They soon reached another Indian village, meeting with a warm reception. Later, Costanzo wrote that the Kumeyaay are of haughty temper, daring, covetous, great jesters and braggarts, although of little valour. They make great boast of their powers and hold the most respect for the most valiant. This evaluation of the character of the local natives presaged the tortured path that Spanish-Indian relations would follow throughout California. Demographic and ethnic growth of California. The demographic and ethnic growth of the new Spanish outpost shows a society composed mainly of unmarried males of diverse ethnicities. Historians have had difficulty determining with certainty who these individuals were. For a decade, San Diego was a transient presidio, with very few of the soldiers remaining very long, a foreshadowing, perhaps, of the military future for San Diego. The leaders of the founding expedition, Fathers Serra and Crespi and Captain Portola, were Spaniards. This has led some to suppose that the expedition comprised fair-skinned Spanish conquistadors. Notwithstanding the practical impossibility of determining the ethnicity of the surviving soldiers, there is evidence to suggest that the majority of them were probably of mixed blood, mestizos and mulattoes. The Spanish developed a complex system of classifying various mixtures of European, African and Indian parentage. A caste system was used to exclude non-Iberians from higher political and economic posts, and to create a stratified society along racial and economic lines. On the far northern frontier, however, ethnic distinctions blurred and became more fluid. In California, there was a great division between the gente de razón, literally people of reason, meaning those who were Catholic Christians and European in culture, and those sin razón, without reason, the non-converted native people. A great premium was given to those Spaniards who could prove their limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, meaning there was no intermarriage with Jews, Moors, or other non-Christians in their ancestry. Often wealthy people could purchase papers certifying that their bloodlines were pure and European, thus elevating them within the caste system. Hubert Howe Bancroft, a historian of California's pioneers, thought that most of the settlers in California were half-breeds. Nevertheless, in the late 19th century, Americans considered the first Spanish-speaking settlers to be Spaniards. However, Los Angeles's founding families are an example of the importance of non-Spanish-born settlers. Of the 11 male heads of households who were among the founders of Los Angeles in 1781, only 2 were Iberians. The others were a multi-ethnic group that was predominantly Indian, mulatto, and mestizo. Historians have found that many Spanish-speaking colonists throughout the Southwest were not Iberian Spaniards, but of mixed blood, castes, and Hispanicized Indians, most of whom had migrated from adjacent Mexican frontier provinces. The first evidence we have of the surviving colonists' ethnicity in the San Diego Presidio, for example, is the Spanish census taken in 1790, which counted 190 persons. Of the 96 adults, 49 were Espanols, but only 3 of those had been born in Europe. The rest had probably been whitened. On the frontier, people could pass, depending on their wealth and occupation, to meet Mexico City's requirements that most of the soldiers be Espanol. The census listed the balance of the soldiers as mulattoes and colores quebrados, some African ancestry, mestizos and coyotes, degrees of Indian-Spanish mixture, and indios. Whatever the ethnicity of the settlers and colonists who came to Alta California from Mexico, their numbers grew slowly. Mestizaje, or the mixture of races and cultures, began in Mexico with the Conquest and continued on the far northern frontier. Soldiers married local Indian women, and female immigrants who came to California were mostly mestizo or mulatto. By 1800, some 31 years after the initial settlement in San Diego, the total Spanish-speaking population in California, excluding the mission Indians, priests and soldiers, was probably about 550 people in about 100 families. This small group lived in 3 pueblos, surrounded by perhaps as many as 30,000 mission Indians. Meanwhile, most native peoples remained free of the mission system and never accepted Spanish domination. The missions. Without a doubt, the most important Spanish institutions in Alta California were the missions, for they changed the way of life for thousands of native people and formed the economic backbone of the province. The object of the missions was to convert the natives to Christianity as well as to Hispanicize them, instructing them in the rudiments of the Spanish language and culture. After a period of time specified in the law of the Indies as 10 years, the missions were to be secularized or disbanded, and the mission Indians were to form new towns and be converted into loyal farmers and ranchers. In this way, the Spanish hoped to extend their control over all of California. This was the ideal, but in fact, after 10 years, the mission fathers concluded that the Indians were not able to make the transition, and they postponed freedom for their charges again and again. The final objective was to turn the Indian people into Christian laborers, who would be loyal to the Spanish crown and capable of defending themselves against intrusions by hostile Indians and foreigners. Beginning with the first mission at San Diego, Father Junipero Serra labored to find as many missions as possible. Serra was one of a generation of frontier priests who combined extremes of asceticism and self-denial with practical political sense and a fighting spirit. He was born on the Spanish island of Majorca to poor parents who sent him away to a Franciscan school where he was encouraged to become a priest because of his intelligence. When he was only 24, he was appointed professor of theology, and for 5 years he taught at distinguished Spanish universities. In 1749, he gave up his prestigious career to travel to Mexico. Arriving in Veracruz, he insisted on walking hundreds of miles to Mexico City, an act of willpower and commitment that he repeated many times in his life. Serra worked among the Indians in Mexico as a missionary and an administrator of the College of San Fernando. In 1767, the Jesuits were expelled from the New World, and Serra was chosen to administer the missions they had built in Baja California. A few years later, despite being an asthmatic and suffering a chronic leg injury, Serra travelled north to lead the founding of new missions in Alta California. For the rest of his life, he suffered from scurvy and exhaustion due to walking hundreds of miles. He also practiced many mortifications of the flesh, such as wearing shirts with barbs, self-flagellation and self-burning, to purify his spirit. Father Serra established San Carlos Borromeo, the mission at Monterrey, which was later moved to the Carmel River. He also founded the missions of San Antonio de Padua, San Gabriel Arcángel, San Luis Obispo de Tolosa, San Francisco de Asís, San Juan Capistrano, San Buenaventura, and Santa Clara de Asís. After Serra died in 1784, Father Fermín Francisco de la Suén laboured from 1785 to 1803 to complete the construction of 9 more missions. The last one, established in the Mexican era, was founded in 1823 after his death. The missions totaled 21, each about a day's ride apart and strategically located near the coast. Father Lasuen was a gentle and refined man, wholly devoted to Father Serra's memory. Besides building new missions, Lasuen expanded and rebuilt older mission buildings. Under his diplomatic guidance, the mission system prospered, experiencing less conflict with the military and government than had been true under Serra. The conversion of the Indians was not easy. Initially, the natives who were to be missionized were not willing participants in this project. At first, the harvest of souls was alarmingly meagre. After its founding, a year passed at Mission San Diego before the first convert was made. This was followed by several revolts against the mission padres, fathers or priests. At the missions located near Presidio or Pueblo, there were frequent problems between the native people and the soldiers or civilians. The priests often complained of the corrupting influence of Spanish ways. Rapes of Indian women were a frequent source of conflict, causing many of them to flee into the backcountry to get away from the Spaniards. As a result, Serra moved 2 missions, San Diego and Monterrey, farther away from their nearby Presidios. Conversions occurred nevertheless because the Spanish priests offered food and goods that the native people found valuable. Ethnohistorians have argued to what degree environmental factors influenced their conversions. Periodic droughts, along with the destruction of native plants due to cattle, pigs, and other livestock grazing, pressured some Indian communities to seek the relative security of mission food stores. There were other complex reasons for their baptism. Often the natives came to the missions out of curiosity and were converted without fully understanding the import of their actions. Once baptized, they were called neophytes and were subject to the authority of the padre, who began to regulate their lives to lead them toward becoming a full member of the Christian community. If they ran away, soldiers were sent to hunt them down, bring them back, and help in their punishment. Sometimes the soldiers seized any Indians they could find, whether they were runaways or not. Once the mission reached a critical mass, having enough neophytes to farm surpluses and raise cattle, the mission became a magnet for those who needed food, and conversion to Christianity was a way to ensure survival. In this way, the 21 missions slowly grew in size and economic importance. During the 65 years of their existence, the fathers baptized 79,000 California Indians. The most populous and prosperous of the missions were those in Southern California, including San Gabriel and Mission San Luis Rey. The missions produced the bulk of the province's food to feed the colonists and soldiers. The natives were taught to grow wheat, corn, barley and other grain crops, to cultivate grapevines and olive orchards, and to raise cattle and other livestock. The mission fathers trained some neophytes as artisans, shoemakers, gunsmiths, carpenters, blacksmiths and masons. Others learned to weave textiles, make candles and tan hides. The fathers taught their charges European instruments and music, and Indian choirs and orchestras performed religious music for special masses and fiestas. The mission Indians were responsible for tending the vineyards, fruit orchards and wheat fields and raising thousands of cattle and horses. The work regime at the California missions followed a strict timetable, including morning and evening prayers and the segregation of workers by sex. Workers were overseen by Indian mayordomos, overseers, and alcaldes, leaders. Neophytes worked 6 days a week for 5 to 8 hours a day. Roll call was taken at every meal, and those shirking their duties were punished by imprisonment or whippings. Pablo Tac recalled that the Indian mayordomos were there to hurry them if they are lazy, and to punish the guilty or lazy one who leaves his plough and quits the field. At night, the unmarried women and sometimes the men were locked in dormitories. At some missions, neophytes were allowed to return to their villages for short durations to gather supplemental foods, but they were expected to return for mass and work when needed. The padres controlled the allocation of food, rationing it according to their judgment of the economic needs of the mission and those of their charges. An interrogatorio or questionnaire sent from Mexico City in the early 1800s asked the mission fathers a series of questions, one about the diet of the mission Indians. The answers reveal the diversity of the missions while allowing for the padres' desire to make conditions appear favorable. Father Martinez at Mission San Luis Obispo stated that he gave his workers 3 meals a day: atole, a corn gruel in the morning, pozole, a soup of wheat, grains and meat, at noon, and at night, another serving of atole. At Mission San Buenaventura, Father José Señan stated that he gave the Indians 1 meal a day, inasmuch as when they work, they also eat. Other missionaries testified that the Indians continued gathering traditional foods which supplemented the mission food supply. Neophyte resistance. For many native Californians, the missions were not a positive experience. They were coerced into working and staying against their will, fearing punishment if they ran away. The most dreadful consequence of their stay was their exposure to European diseases, which often proved fatal. They had no resistance to chickenpox, measles, smallpox and influenza, and deaths mounted with each passing year, even in areas far from Spanish settlements. Venereal disease was especially deadly. Thousands of mission neophytes died from syphilis and gonorrhea, and the epidemic spread to non-mission Indians as well. The strict regulations, humiliation, punishments for minor offences, and rapes of women by soldiers engendered a smouldering resentment of the Spaniards. Often, a chief grievance was the lack of food. The strict discipline of the mission fathers and the destruction of the indigenous food sources by cattle, sheep and horses created levels of starvation at some missions. Conditions were such that the number of runaways increased, and in some cases, there were rebellions. The first uprising was at Mission San Diego, only 6 years after its founding. On November 4, 1775, around midnight, an estimated 1,000 Kumeyaay Indians attacked the mission. They burned most of it to the ground, killing Fathers Luis Jaime and Vicente Fuster, who became California's first martyrs. The survivors of the first attack took refuge in an adobe storehouse, where they held off the Indians until dawn. They were finally rescued by a group of loyal neophytes and Baja California Indians. The uprising apparently came at the instigation of 2 brothers, Carlos and Francisco, both newly baptized neophytes, who had been punished for stealing a fish from an old woman. Carlos was the chief of the local rancheria. Resenting their treatment by the padres, they ran away from the mission and began to organize an uprising of the surrounding rancherias. When they learned that about half the Presidio garrison had been sent north to San Juan Capistrano, they saw this as their chance to wipe out the Spaniards once and for all. In the Spanish investigation that followed, some accused the resident neophytes of helping the attackers, but they denied it, insisting that they had been forced to go along with the uprising. In the years that followed, there were other rebellions. In 1781, Quechan, Yuman, Indians, attacked the two missions built on the Colorado River's California side. The attack occurred when Captain Fernando de Rivera y Moncada and a party of colonists bound for California were passing through. Rivera's troops had abused some of the Quechan peoples, and the distribution of gifts was considered inadequate. The natives attacked, destroying both missions and killing 4 friars, 30 soldiers, and Rivera himself. The massacre ended all further land travel between Mexico and California during the Spanish period. In 1785, at Mission San Gabriel, a woman named Toypurina, along with 3 other native men, planned to lead a group of Indios Barbaros, non-mission Indians, from 6 surrounding villages and join with neophytes to overthrow the Spanish authorities. However, the soldiers learned of the planned rebellion and arrested the leaders. Put on trial, Toypurina explained her motivations, saying, "I'm angry with the padres and all of those of the mission for living here on my native soil, for trespassing upon the land of my forefathers, and despoiling our tribal domains." Toypurina was banished to Monterrey, where she eventually was baptized and married a Presidio soldier. During the Mexican period, a major rebellion occurred among the Chumash people on the eve of the secularization of the missions in 1824. The cause of this rebellion was the mistreatment of the neophytes by the soldiers and the strict work regime. Thousands of neophytes allied with Gentiles, unbaptized Indians, from the interior and took over La Purísima and Santa Ynez missions for more than a month, and briefly occupied Mission Santa Barbara. After a battle in which the padres tried to prevent needless slaughter, the rebels fled to the interior. Later, Father Vicente Sarria, accompanied by troops led by Pablo de la Portilla, convinced remnants of the Santa Barbara rebels to return. In October of 1828, with the permission of the priest, Padre Duran, an Indian alcalde named Estanislao led scores of his fellow kinsmen away from Mission San Jose to the interior to help his community harvest acorns, nuts, and other foods. Once there, Estanislao notified the Spanish authorities that they were in rebellion. Hundreds of other runaways from the northern missions soon joined him. Estanislao's success in resisting the Spanish government was undoubtedly due partly to the fact that natives from many different groups could now communicate with each other using a lingua franca, Spanish. For a time, Estanislao defeated the expeditions that were sent to subjugate him, until he finally succumbed to Lieutenant Mariano G. Vallejo's expedition. Eventually, Estanislao escaped, returned to Mission San Jose, and received a pardon for his rebellion. He died a few years later, working as an auxiliary soldier who hunted runaway neophytes. The Estanislao rebellion created tremendous fear among the Spanish settlers in Alta California. As a result of his movement, a network to assist runaway mission Indians grew, and Indian raids on settlements from San Gabriel to San Jose increased. Historian James Sandos has noted that there were a variety of other forms of resistance to the mission system, ranging from graffiti secretly scrawled on mission walls to reports of sacred visions urging natives to renounce their Christian baptism. George Harwood Phillips, an expert on California Indian resistance, has noted that the Stations of the Cross, painted by neophytes at Mission San Fernando, depicted Indian alcaldes as the tormentors of Christ, a subtle message of protest. Other methods of resistance included running away, abortion, and secret retention of traditional customs, such as the use of the temescal. In a few cases, the mission Indians were moved to kill the mission priests, as in the assassination of Father Andres Quintana at Mission Santa Cruz in 1812. Evaluation of the California missions. In the 1980s, devoted Catholics intensified a campaign to canonize Father Junipero Serra as a saint. Immediately, a debate ensued over the record of the treatment of the natives in the missions. Native American activists, in particular, felt outraged that people wanted to honor the man who, they argued, led to the enslavement, mistreatment, and death of their people. They assembled evidence of mistreatment in the form of oral testimony by native peoples. Tribal councils passed resolutions opposing canonization, and academics wrote position papers buttressed by historical quotes and evidence arguing that Sarah should not be honored. The issue of the California Indians' encounter with the Spanish is heated, provoking spirited and emotional defense of Sarah by non-Indian scholars and Catholic leaders. Beatification is a long process, and Sarah has advanced through the preliminary steps. The uproar over this issue demonstrates that the mission period is still very controversial in the lives of people today. The treatment of native peoples is a major point of debate about the Spanish colonization of the Americas. A wide range of historians and anthropologists, as well as Indian activists, agree that the mission system throughout the Southwest, whatever its rationale at the time, resulted in the deaths, nearly all unintentional, of thousands of Native Americans. The mission system in California was perhaps the most extensive, long-lived and destructive of all those established in the Spanish and Mexican frontier. The missions in Texas were abandoned after a short period. The ones in New Mexico provoked a violent, successful rebellion in 1680 that curtailed missionary activities until the Spanish Reconquest in 1692. In Arizona, the missions were few and scattered. However, in California, the 21 missions and their assistencias, branch missions, significantly changed the economy and lifestyle of those who were mission laborers and the way of life of those who lived far from the missions. The Indian population declined. The natives were concentrated in missions, exposed to new and fatal diseases, and deprived of their traditional foods. The extent of the decimation can only be estimated. In California, the missions grew to include about 20,000 neophytes at their peak. The mission annals from 1769 to 1834 recorded 62,600 deaths, but only 29,100 births. Anthropologist Sherburne Cook and historian Albert Hurtado have estimated that the Indian population of California decreased by more than 150,000 during the mission period. In the region where missions were established, the decline of the population was more noticeable. Almost 75% of the native peoples died. Defenders of the missions point out that the mission fathers did not intend to expose their wards to fatal diseases, and that their attitudes toward crime and punishment were a product of the age, not especially cruel for that time. Some martyred friars willingly sacrificed themselves rather than kill natives who attacked them. Father Sarah and other priests advocated forgiveness and pardons for those who ran away, although the military frequently exacted their own punishments for this offence. The priests, however, were not saints, and even Father Sarah was willing to admit that, in the infliction of the punishment, there may have been inequalities and excesses on the part of some fathers. Yet the mission priests' religious devotion to the task of conversion and the spiritual welfare of their flock was beyond question. Their attitudes and beliefs resulted from their historical culture, in which the soul was considered more important than the body, and severe punishments were the norm. Taken as a group, the mission fathers were not vicious for the times in which they lived. The tragedy was that they were helpless to prevent the deaths of the very Indians they sought to save. The missions accomplished a great deal in developing the first agricultural economy in California. The first citrus trees, grapevines, corn, beans, wheat, barley, and oats came with the mission fathers. They promoted raising horses, cattle, pigs, goats, and sheep. The mission economy became the backbone for developing large ranchos in the Mexican era and farms in the American era. The mission fathers trained the Indians to be vaqueros, farmers and skilled workers. As a result, the Indian workforce became crucial to the development of California's economy through much of the 19th century. Nevertheless, we must also consider the missions from the point of view of the native Californians. The mission records themselves help us appreciate their grievances. Large numbers of neophytes ran away from the restrictive controls of the padres, an obvious indication of their dissatisfaction with the mission. By 1817, Mission San Diego had 316 runaways, the second largest number in the system, topped only by Mission San Gabriel, with 595. Running away was often provoked by hunger, and the corporal punishments administered by the mayordomos under the direction of the padres. Despite glowing reports of mission prosperity chronicled by the mission padres, death, disease, and hunger were daily realities of mission life. Deaths from the disease were often hastened by malnutrition. Despite the abundance, the neophytes who worked to make it possible were badly fed. The hunger of the Indians was not limited to the missions. The introduction of European livestock and plants soon took over key hunting and gathering grounds, and there were severe punishments for poaching. Hunger drove non-mission Indians to seek employment and food by working for the Pueblo dwellers and the Presidio garrisons. Bachum. Establishing Presidios and Pueblos. Throughout the Western Hemisphere, the Spanish king and his advisors laid down the policies and directions that guided conquest and colonization. The underlying premise was that the unsettled lands were the king's property and that the native peoples were his subjects. Individual Spaniards were not entirely free to explore or settle where they wanted. The settlement of towns and military outposts was subject to approval, planning, and regulation. Guidelines were articulated in several decrees and laws, the most influential being the Recopilación de Leyes de las Indias in 1680. Despite these regulations, the frontier settlers often did not follow the laws of the letter. Captain Gaspar de Portola, commander of one of the first expeditions sent to colonize California, had specific orders to find a presidio at Monterey Bay. In 1769, he marched north from San Diego into new territory with only 12 soldiers and a contingent of Baja California Indians. The ship San Antonio was to meet them in Monterey with Father Serra and others. As they passed through Southern California, the natives were friendly and curious. In July, they experienced a violent earthquake near the Santa Ana River and noted the richness of the grasslands in the Los Angeles Basin. Portola's land expedition stayed along the coast, but had to cross the coastal range north of San Luis Obispo. They finally saw Monterey Bay, but Portola did not recognize it from previous descriptions, so he pushed further north. Finally, a group led by Sergeant José Francisco de Ortega, Portola's scout, stumbled upon San Francisco Bay, viewing it for the first time from a hill. A few months later, in May, Portola founded the Presidio of Monterey, south of San Francisco, and built a wooden stockade and shelters for the troops. Father Serra, who had arrived in Monterey by ship, organized the construction of a mission called San Carlos Borromeo near the Presidio, and on June 3, 1770, they formally dedicated both structures. As was true throughout Latin America, the mission and the Presidio were the first undertakings in the Spanish colonization of new territories. These were soon followed by the founding of civil settlements, or pueblos, forming a three-pronged strategy for settlement policy. In California's first settlement in San Diego, the most immediate need was for more provisions and reinforcements. Due to diligent lobbying by Father Serra, who returned to Mexico City after founding the Presidio at Monterey, the government sent other expeditions to California to strengthen the tiny settlements. The new viceroy, Antonio de Bucarelli, was receptive to pleas for more support because he had evidence of Russian and British interest in California. In 1773, he issued a reglamento, a statement of how the new colony should be administered. This document was later slightly modified and reissued by Felipe de Neve, the newly appointed governor of California. Known as the Neve Reglamento, this document guided the colony's administration until the end of the Spanish period, 1821. It emphasized the importance of the conversion of the natives and the establishment of missions, of careful planning in laying out towns, of careful record-keeping, and of regular supply ships from Mexico. Bucarelli suggested secularizing the missions and foresaw they would become the center of towns. The same year that he issued the Reglamento, Bucarelli permitted Captain Juan Bautista de Anza, an important frontier soldier and explorer, to open a trail between Spanish settlements in southern Arizona and California, and ordered him to establish a presidio on San Francisco Bay. The next year, Anza succeeded in leading an expedition of 20 soldiers and 200 livestock over the desert trails from Tucson to the mission at San Gabriel and then north to Monterey. In 1775, Anza led another expedition with more than 240 colonists, making the 1,500-mile journey, during which 8 babies were born, and there was only one death, a woman who died in childbirth. Most of the settlers went on to Monterey, and a contingent helped establish a new Presidio. Unfortunately, due to political conflicts with Lieutenant Governor Fernando Rivera y Moncada, Anza could not lead the final expedition to settle San Francisco himself. So, on September 17, 1776, Lieutenant José Moraga and Fathers Francisco Palou and Pedro Cambon founded the Presidio and the Mission of San Francisco. The Spanish government decided to found civil towns in California primarily as agricultural centers to provide food for their presidios. The mission fathers had resisted having the Presidio depend on the mission for supplies. 3 official pueblos were eventually founded in California during the Spanish era: San José de Guadalupe, San José, el pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles del Río de Porciúncula, Los Ángeles, and the Villa de Branciforte, Santa Cruz. Following long-established Spanish customs of town planning, the Viceroy allowed the settlers certain rights, among them the right to elect a town government to regulate matters of daily life and the right to hold private property or town lots. Each pueblo was given a grant of land to be administered by the local government for the common good. Usually this grant approximated 4 square leagues, or nearly 20 square miles, a size that included a village and surrounding agricultural lands. The civil settlements in California were populated by settlers drawn from the local presidios and from special colonizing expeditions. In 1777, the California governor Felipe Neve authorized 14 men and their families to leave the presidios of Monterey and San Francisco to find the pueblo of San Jose. In 1781, Neve authorized a colonizing expedition of 12 settlers and their families from Sinaloa to settle near Mission San Gabriel in Southern California near Yangna, an Indian village. This was the pueblo of Los Angeles, founded on September 4, 1781, by a group composed mostly of mulatto and mestizo families. Branciforte was the last town founded in the Spanish period and the least successful. In 1796, the government tried to recruit retired soldiers from Mexico to live in the new town, but no one wanted to go north to the forbidden lands of Alta California. Finally, the government recruited convicts and their families and forced them to settle in the new town, but it did not flourish. It may seem strange today that more Mexican colonists did not go north to California during the Spanish and Mexican periods. This lack of large-scale movement was attributable to several factors. First, there was a cultural predisposition to prefer urban life to life in the hinterland. Most of the Mexican population was not free to move about and live where they wanted. Spain and then Mexico tried to control and regulate the movement of people away from the metropolitan center. Second, most people in Mexico had developed deep ties to their extended families and regions and were reluctant to abandon their homes for the dangerous unknown territory to the north. There was widespread ignorance of the resources and climate of the north, in addition to stories of Indian attacks, gruesome deaths, and massacres on the northern frontier. Finally, it was not easy to travel to California overland from Mexico. Settlers had to traverse the Sonora and Mojave deserts, which unfriendly Indians controlled. The cost of travel for most Mexicans was prohibitive, unless the government subsidized the expedition. Similar barriers worked to prevent a large-scale migration of settlers to other regions north of Mexico. Spain gave fewer than 20 land grants to individuals during its rule of California, all to ex-soldiers, as a reward for their services. Most of the good land was reserved for the missions, and it was not until the Mexican period, after 1821, that private land grants became common. The civilian settlers in the 3 Spanish towns relied primarily on agriculture and stock raising for their living. To assist them in their labours, they borrowed Indian neophytes from the nearby missions and employed local Gentiles or unbaptized Indians. The government tried to limit exploitation and corruption through regulation, but this was largely ineffective. The employment of mission Indians in the towns was so popular that it seriously threatened the mission fathers' conversion efforts. Without California Indians working in the fields of the townlands, the Spanish pueblos probably would have failed. Gender relations in Spanish California. The first expeditions of explorers and settlers to San Diego in 1769 did not include women, but it was evident to Spanish authorities that women would be essential for the long-term success of the colonization effort. Antonia Castañeda, Gloria Miranda, Rosaura Sanchez and others have written about women's important role in this period of California's history. In general, they have reported that the patriarchal values of their society severely limited Spanish and Mexican women, but they also retained a degree of protection and autonomy. Indian women, however, were more likely to be victims of the early male-oriented exploration and conquest of California than Spanish and Mexican women were. Following their experience in central Mexico, the mission padres sought to eliminate Indian customs and attitudes towards sexuality that conflicted with Catholic doctrine and morals. Accordingly, the priests severely punished women for sexual misconduct. For example, at Mission San Diego, one native woman miscarried and then was charged with infanticide and forced to endure humiliating punishments. The priests encouraged neophyte women's fertility since all children were to be born into the Christian faith. At the same time, however, the priests outlawed Indian dances, ceremonies and songs that were part of their fertility ritual. Women who refused to comply were sometimes accused of being witches. Males in the secular population, especially the soldiers, often raped Indian women. This became a source of conflict between the Spanish and the native Californians. Rape, as analyzed by historian Antonia Castañeda, was more than a personal act of lust. It also was a means of subjugating the native population and expressing the power of the male colonizer over the colonized, both male and female. It served to humiliate and subjugate the Indian men and families. A few Spanish colonists settled down and established families with Indian women. Initially, a few soldiers married native women at the priests' encouragement. Castañeda found that in the 1770s, 37% of the Monterrey Presidio soldiers married local Indian women. But for the entire period, the intermarriage rate was just 15%. Women from Mexico were necessary to reproduce the culture of the mother country, and it therefore became a priority to import female colonists. Non-California Indian women either came with their husbands from Mexico on various expeditions or alone, as was the case with Maria Feliciana Arbalo, who travelled to California with her 2 children in the Anza expedition of 1775. Additionally, in 1800, the government sent a group of 10 girls and 9 boys who were orphans to California, where they were distributed among families already there. The girls, with one exception, were married within a few years. Gloria Miranda has studied women in Spanish Los Angeles. She found that almost all the marriages were arranged, and at a tender age, 13 was the youngest age at marriage, while the average age in the pueblo was 20. Very few adult women remained single due to the overall scarcity of women. The more affluent families tended to have many children, which befitted their means. Ignacio Vicente Ferrer Vallejo, an early settler in Monterrey, had 13 children. His son, Mariano Vallejo, fathered 16 children, and José María Pico, a soldier in San Diego, fathered 10 children. Spanish colonial society was patriarchal, with the ethic of honour deeply ingrained. A man's honour depended on his ability to control others, particularly the women within the family. The Church's doctrines and hierarchy supported notions of male domination and superiority. Yet women could carve out niches of respect, partly because, under colonial laws, they had property rights within marriage. The notion of community property for women was part of the Spanish codes. The idea was to protect the honour of a woman and her family of origin within a marriage. Rosaura Sanchez studied the narratives of Mexican Californian women, which Hubert Howe Bancroft collected in the 1870s. Several illustrate how mestiza women in Spanish California related to male authority. One narrative is the story of Apolinaria Lorenzana, a woman who came to California as one of the orphans in 1800. She grew up in San Diego, but refused to marry, working instead as a school teacher and then as a nurse and teacher at the mission. She earned the nickname La Beata, the pious one, because of her devotion to helping Indians. During the Mexican period, she received 2 rancho land grants from the governor to reward her services. She bought a 3rd rancho and lived an independent life from the revenues. Lorenzana's life reveals her independence, strength of character, and dedication to her work. Another account is that of Eulalia Perez, who worked as a levera or keeper of the keys at Mission San Gabriel. Among other things, Eulalia was in charge of ensuring the girls were locked in at night in their dormitory. She also supervised and directed many of the routines of mission life: the rationing of food, the training of women as weavers, and the catechizing of the neophytes. Eulalia's story completely accepts the mission as a humane institution whose primary mission is to teach. Neither Perez nor Lorenzana was critical of the treatment given to mission Indians, but rather they saw themselves as humanizing the acculturation process. We also have the story of Eulalia Callis, who was the wife of California Governor Pedro Vargas. She desperately wanted to leave the desolate California frontier and return to Mexico City. In 1785, she publicly accused her husband of infidelity and filed a petition for legal separation. She refused to accept a compromise mediated by the priests and continued slandering the governor. The authorities arrested her and, because she was a woman, kept her locked up inside Mission San Carlos Borromeo for 2 months. During that time, she began proceedings for a divorce, but before they were completed, the couple reconciled. She persuaded Fages to resign a year later, and the family returned to Mexico. Contemporary historians see Eulalia's story as evidence of female independence and outrage in the face of patriarchy, but it also reveals that women had the right to divorce, even in colonial New Spain. Spanish Californian culture. During the Spanish administration of California, the military and the church were the dominant powers enforcing discipline according to the law. Civil culture existed primarily in the towns, where people were freer from authoritarian rules. The hacienda lifestyle had not yet developed, because Spain granted very few private ranchos in this period. Spanish society was decidedly male, primarily governed by the military and the church. The culture that the Spanish settlers brought with them from central Mexico and the adjacent northern frontier settlement made family the core of society. A family that was, in theory, strictly governed by the father. Many families were related by marriage or compadrazgo, godparentage. Thus, the idea of family was not limited to the nuclear one, but to an extensive network of individuals scattered throughout the province. In Hispanic cultures, godparents frequently acted as surrogate parents, and they expected the same respect and obligations from their godchildren as they did from their children. Hospitality was also an important value and fact of life, given the scarcity of the population and the common religion, Catholicism. Despite the many rules governing behavior, challenges to authority were inevitable. Sexual misconduct by both men and women was punished. In the 1790s, Sebastián Alvitre of Los Angeles and Francisco Avila of San Jose were punished with sentences of forced work, prison, and exile for fornicating with Indian and married women. The provincial records are full of warnings from officials about the evils and punishments of adultery and sexual impropriety. Likewise, the authorities tried with mixed success to regulate gambling and the consumption of alcohol. There were no formal schools in Alta California before 1800, when Governor Baricha established the first school. The school was in a public granary in San Jose and was taught by retired Sergeant Manuel Vargas. Funding for the school came from a compulsory tax of 31 cents per pupil. Eventually, Vargas was lured to teach in San Diego, where the citizens raised $250 for his pay. Several other schools sprang up in San Jose and Santa Barbara. The primary subject was La Doctrina Christiana, the Catechism and Doctrine, followed by reading and writing. By 1820, there were approximately 3,270 Spanish and Mestizo settlers in California, many of them children from large families. Most of the population growth until this time had been through natural increase rather than immigration. The native Indians deeply influenced the kind of culture that evolved. The missionized Indians did almost all the work in constructing the Presidios, missions, and public works. Most of the Spanish male adult population consisted of soldiers, priests, or administrators. Intermarriage with native women and with women who came north from Mexico produced many children. The spirit of the culture remained that of a frontier outpost, whose survival still depended on the authoritarian institutions of the military and the church. As noted earlier, the first government in California was a military one, headed in 1769 by Governor Pedro Fages. In ecclesiastical affairs, power was shared with Father Serra, the father president of the missions. From the start and continuing thereafter, conflicts arose between the two authorities. Serra fought with Fages over where to build the missions and over the sexual misconduct of the soldiers toward Indian women. For the next 40 years, clerics occasionally criticized the military government for not protecting the missions or for soldiers' misbehavior. In 1771, Felipe de Neve became the military governor, and he energetically set about founding new pueblos and presidios by recruiting more colonists from Mexico. Accordingly, secular authority within the province became more important. The 3 pueblos were given forms of self-government, including the right to elect officials and to make local ordinances. Neve ordered that mission Indians be allowed the same rights and that certain prerogatives of the clergy be reduced. The Spanish town government established in California was a type of local democracy. The system underwent some changes in the Mexican era, but its basic character was that of a Spanish institution. Each male head of household of the pueblo was given a small grant of land from the community lands granted by the king. These landholders had the right to vote in elections, which were held yearly. Historian Michael Gonzalez summarized the town government in Los Angeles in the 1830s. Although the structure of the Mexican era changed slightly, the town government election system reflected Spanish traditions. At 9 in the morning, the property-owning pobladores were summoned to the plaza by a drum roll. After hearing nomination speeches for the various offices, they voted by a show of hands for electors, called Compromisar IOS. These electors then selected the town council members, or ayuntamiento. These included 1 alcalde, or administrator, judge, 2 regidores, or councilmen, the sindico, or town attorney, and an escribano, or secretary. During the Spanish era, the military governor appointed an additional member, the comisionado, instead of an alcalde when no literate person was available. The comisionado had veto power over actions taken by the council. Members of the ayuntamiento were limited to 2 terms in office. The town council met weekly to hear petitions for land, hear domestic strife accusations, rule on public ordinances violations, and decide on action in times of crisis. In the Spanish era, the military government had more control over the town councils than was true in the Mexican period. The exact composition and duties of the members varied from pueblo to pueblo. But essentially, the ayuntamiento allowed the Spanish colonists to have a form of self-government and free expression. Among the missionized Indians, the missionaries allowed the alcaldes to have the authority to mediate minor disputes and to exercise some authority as a leader during times of war. The mission fathers relied on the Indian alcaldes as intermediaries whose authority could be countermanded by the padre. The town records of the pueblos provide a glimpse into the realities of daily life. The pueblo of Los Angeles was the largest of the Spanish towns, with more than 615 settlers in 1820. About a third of the vecinos lived in surrounding ranchos and had homes in the pueblo proper. Los Angeles was known as a settlement where there were conflicts between the local officials and the general population. The annals of the Spanish period are full of disputes, complaints, petitions, and grievances directed against the government by the vecinos. Pio Pico remembered that upon his arrival in Los Angeles from San Diego, he was ordered by the local alcalde to work on the new aqueduct. But Pico refused because he considered the alcalde a brutish, ignorant man. José Sanchez complained that an alcalde put him in irons because he refused to copy some documents without pay. The pueblo did not have a church until 1822, and to comply with the law of attending Mass, one had to travel to Mission San Gabriel. The pobladores built their homes around the plaza area, with streets running roughly in a grid pattern. A zanja madre, or main irrigation ditch, ran through the centre of the town and was used for washing, bathing and drinking. Other small civilian settlements, ruled by military officials from the local Presidios, appeared in San Diego, Monterey and San Francisco. Their growth would increase during the Mexican period. The civilian settlers depended on the missions for surplus food and skilled and unskilled workers, and the Presidios for protection. The church and military authorities sought to control the settlers' lives, but with the increase in population and political changes brought about by independence from Spain, this control diminished. Political developments in Spanish California. As noted earlier, the first government in California was a military one, headed in 1769 by Governor Pedro Fages. Power was shared with Father Serra, the father president of the missions in charge of ecclesiastical affairs. From the start and continuing thereafter, conflicts arose between the two authorities. Serra fought with Fages over where to build the missions and over the sexual misconduct of the soldiers toward Indian women. For the next 40 years, clerics occasionally criticized the military government for the lack of protection of the missions or for the misbehavior of soldiers. In 1771, Felipe de Neve became the military governor, and he energetically set about founding new pueblos and presidios by recruiting more colonists from Mexico. Accordingly, secular authority within the province became more important. The three pueblos were given forms of self-government, including the right to elect officials and to make local ordinances. Neve ordered that mission Indians be allowed the same rights and that certain prerogatives of the clergy be reduced. The Spanish town government established in California was a type of local democracy. The system underwent some changes in the Mexican era, but its basic character was that of a Spanish institution. Each male head of household of the pueblo was given a small grant of land from the community lands granted by the king. These landholders had the right to vote in elections, which were held yearly. Historian Michael Gonzalez summarized the town government in Los Angeles in the 1830s. Although the structure of the Mexican era changed slightly, the town government election system reflected Spanish traditions. At 9 a.m, the property-owning pobladores were summoned to the plaza by a drum roll. After hearing nomination speeches for the various offices, they voted by a show of hands for electors, called Compromisar IOS. These electors then selected the members of the town council or ayuntamiento. These included one alcalde, or administrator judge, 2 regidors, or councilmen, the syndico, or town attorney, and an escribano, or secretary. During the Spanish era, the military governor appointed an additional member, the comisionado, in lieu of an alcalde when no literate person was available. The comisionado had veto power over actions taken by the council. Members of the ayuntamiento were limited to 2 terms in office. The town council met weekly to hear petitions for land, listen to accusations of domestic strife, rule on violations of public ordinances, and decide on action in times of crisis. In the Spanish era, the military government had more control over the town councils than was true in the Mexican period. The exact composition and duties of the members varied from pueblo to pueblo. But essentially, the ayuntamiento allowed the Spanish colonists a form of self-government and free expression. Among the missionized Indians, the missionaries allowed the alcaldes to have the authority to mediate minor disputes and to exercise some authority as a leader during times of war. The mission fathers relied on the Indian alcaldes as intermediaries whose authority could be countermanded by the padre. The town records of the pueblos provide a glimpse into the realities of daily life. The pueblo of Los Angeles was the largest of the Spanish towns, with more than 615 settlers in 1820. About a third of the vecinos lived in surrounding ranchos and had homes in the pueblo proper. Los Angeles was a settlement where there were conflicts between the local officials and the general population. The annals of the Spanish period are full of disputes, complaints, petitions, and grievances directed against the government by the vecinos. Pío Pico remembered that upon his arrival in Los Angeles from San Diego, he was ordered by the local alcalde to work on the new aqueduct. But Pico refused because he considered the alcalde a brutish, ignorant man. José Sánchez complained that an alcalde put him in irons because he refused to copy some documents without pay. The pueblo did not have a church until 1822, and in order to comply with the law of attending Mass, one had to travel to Mission San Gabriel. The pobladores built their homes around the plaza area, with streets running roughly in a grid pattern. A Zanja Madre, or main irrigation ditch, ran through the centre of the town and was used for washing, bathing and drinking. Other small civilian settlements, ruled by military officials from the local Presidios, appeared in San Diego, Monterrey and San Francisco. Their growth would increase during the Mexican period. The civilian settlers were dependent on the missions for surplus food and skilled and unskilled workers, and on the Presidios for protection. The church and military authorities sought to control the settlers' lives, but with the increase in population and with political changes brought about by independence from Spain, this control diminished. The Wars of Independence in New Spain. In 1810, the colonists living in New Spain began a lengthy rebellion and civil war that eventually resulted in independence in 1821. The precipitating causes of the rebellion in New Spain, soon to be called Mexico, were the exclusion of many criollos, the children of Spaniards who were born in the New World, from important political and ecclesiastical posts, and the long-term oppression of the Indian population. In a complex series of events, involving the overthrow of the Spanish government by a French revolutionary army in 1809 and a struggle among the Creoles and Spaniards over who would be the caretaker of royal authority in the Americas, millions of Indians, mulattoes and mestizos came to question the legitimacy of the royal government. Eventually, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a priest in the small town of Dolores, emerged as the leader of an insurrection. Although he was captured and executed a year later, the rebellion continued with new leaders, lasting more than 11 years and ravaging Mexico's economy and population. In the process, California became even more isolated from the central government of Mexico, as resources were used by the king to fight both the rebels in the New World and the French in Europe. This lack of resources created an economic crisis throughout the borderlands, which weakened the missions as well as the Presidios. News travelled slowly, and the Californians did not learn of the rebellion until 1811. Most clerics were loyal to Spain, since many of them were Spanish Peninsular. The military commanders similarly owed allegiance and their careers to the established monarchy. A few young Californios decided to join the rebellion. In 1811, Francisco Maria Ruiz, the comandante of the Presidio at San Diego, discovered a seditious paper being circulated among some of the troops. This was probably propaganda from the Hidalgo rebellion in Mexico. Ruiz found that 60 men had formed a conspiracy to overthrow Spanish authority, and he promptly arrested 5 of the ringleaders, including José María Pico, the father of the future Mexican governor of California, Pío Pico. 2 of the San Diego conspirators were eventually released, but 3 others died in irons within the Presidio jail. Years passed without incident until the fall of 1818, when news came that the French pirate Hippolyte Bouchard was working his way down the California coast, ravaging Spanish settlements. He raided Monterrey and torched the Presidio in November, then sailed down the coast and landed a party at Dana Point to get supplies from Mission San Juan Capistrano. News of an impending attack on San Diego made for sleepless nights, but Bouchard bypassed the harbour. The only result of this agitation was to motivate the government to send more troops and money to San Diego. The California garrisons and mission fathers remained loyal to Spain. The idea of a social rebellion of Indians led by Creole liberals was anathema to the Spanish-speaking residents of the pueblos. Everyone knew that in California, the natives outnumbered the colonists by more than 10-1. There would be no revolution in California, at least not yet. On April 20th, 1822, news of the proclamation of Mexico's independence from Spain arrived by ship in San Diego Harbor. Throughout the province, the officers, soldiers, and civilians were required to take oaths of allegiance to the newly independent government. The friars and neophytes were required to take a similar oath. There were no reported protests to this change of allegiance. A few Spanish priests left California, but most stayed. Within a few months, the de razón, Spanish and mestizo, male population of the province began involving themselves in the politics of the new government. While Mexico's independence seemed to make no apparent immediate difference in the daily lives of the Californios, profound social and economic transformations were on the way that would radically alter the lives of natives and Californios alike. Foreign interest in Spanish California. One motive for founding a Spanish colony in Alta California was to preempt other European powers from encroaching on the Pacific coast. During the 52 years of Spanish control, Britain, France, and Russia launched exploration expeditions to the coast of California. These European rivals threatened the Spanish monopoly in the Pacific and were of great concern to the Spanish king and his advisors. In 1786, the French Comte de la Pérouse visited Monterey for 10 days during a voyage around the world. He surveyed the mission system, pronounced it an abject failure, and made notes about the Spanish settlement's cultural and military weaknesses. This, of course, was to justify and encourage a possible French takeover of Spanish California. Later, he published his impressions along with some of the first European sketches of the California natives and countryside. Another explorer who made known the resources of the Pacific coast was Alexandro Malaspina, an Italian commissioned by the King of Spain to visit his American possessions and search for the Northwest Passage. Malaspina had artists and scientists on board to report on the local environments and cultures. In 1792, his ships visited Monterey, where he stayed for 2 weeks making observations on the flora and fauna as well as the local inhabitants. The English explorer George Vancouver visited California ports 3 times between 1792 and 1794. He later published his observations about the deficiencies of the Spanish settlements. Secretly, he reported the weaknesses of the Spanish defences in California to the English king, an indication of England's interest in acquiring this territory. In 1796, Ebenezer Dawe commanded the first American ship, the Otter, which visited California. Dawe's visit was notable mainly because he left behind 11 Australian convicts who had stowed away on his ship. For a year they worked as skilled artisans in Monterey, but then the governor sent them by ship to Spain. Following this first visit, other American otter hunting ships navigated off the coast and illegally traded manufactured goods with the locals. One of the most memorable foreign visits to California was made by Nikolai Rezanov, a representative of the Russian-American Fur Company. In 1806, he visited San Francisco ostensibly to obtain supplies for the Russian fur outpost at Sitka, but more probably to investigate the fur trading prospects in California. The California governor was initially opposed to giving aid to the Russians, since that would strengthen their colony, which was in territory claimed by Spain. During his stay, Rezanov met and fell in love with Concepcion Arguello, the 16-year-old daughter of the Comandante of the Presidio in San Francisco. The family agreed to the marriage, with Concepcion's approval. The governor also granted permission for a cargo of food to be sent to Sitka. Promising to return after he was granted permission by the Tsar to marry, Rezanov returned to Russia. Unfortunately, while crossing Siberia on his way to St. Petersburg, he died. Meanwhile, Concepcion waited in vain for the return of Count Rezanov. Her vigil lasted 35 years until she finally received news of Rezanov's death. For the rest of her life she refused all suitors and took on the robes of a beata, a holy woman, devoting herself to acts of charity. In later years, this tragic love story became the subject of poems and novels, part of Spanish California's romantic past. Following the Rezanov visit, other Russian ships visited California ports, seeking sea otter pelts, sealskins and provisions. In 1812, the Russian-American Fur Company, after negotiating with the Pomo Indians, built a wooden stockade fort 18 miles north of Bodega Bay. They called it Fort Rosia, an archaic name for Russia. Americans later called it Fort Ross. The purpose of Fort Rosia was to provide a base to grow food for the fur hunting colonies located farther north in Kodiak and Sitka. Eventually, the colony grew to more than 400, a mixture of Aleuts, Russians, and local Indians, and intermarriages between the Aleuts and the local natives promoted peace. The Russian priests were not very active in trying to convert the Indians. Soon the Russians established a seasonal settlement at Bodega Bay as well. Through the writings of La Perouse and Vancouver, in addition to the visits of the Russian and American fur hunters, the richness of California's natural resources became more widely known. The recurring observation that the Spanish authorities were not very successful in exploiting this wealth and that their colony was poorly defended and underpopulated was also of great interest. In subsequent decades, after Mexican independence, California's mythic name as an island of unknown wealth magnetized the imaginations of increasing numbers of non-Spanish speakers. Summary. The Spanish colonization of California, a testament to the resilience of the Spanish-speaking colonists, left its imprint for subsequent generations. Beginning in 1769, they struggled to survive in the midst of hundreds of thousands of native Indians. Despite the challenges, they transplanted their culture to this remote corner of the empire, building military outposts and presidios and constructing missions to protect themselves and control the Indians. In this, they were marginally successful while assimilating tens of thousands of natives. But their colonial strategies also provoked periodic uprisings, many runaways, and the spread of deadly diseases. The California settlers were more successful in transplanting their political and material culture, the first town governments, cattle ranching, and agriculture. The Spanish era, though lasting less than 60 years, left a profound and enduring impact that Californians can still see. The surplus of cattle in California's economy and the reliance on Indian labor were the foundations of the Mexican and early American eras. The importance of family loyalty and Catholic piety, community life, and the ethic of gracious hospitality all continued without interruption among the Spanish-speaking residents. The most visible remnants of Spain in California today are the rebuilt and reconstructed missions, most of which still serve as houses of worship. They have been romanticized in novels and movies as symbols of a distant era. Most are tourist attractions whose tranquil atmosphere suggests a peaceful, pastoral past. For some, however, they stand as symbols of an oppressive regime that began the destruction of a way of life. Spain succeeded in transferring her language and culture to Alta California. Place names echo this heritage: La Jolla, Santa Ana, San Joaquin, Sacramento, Sierra Nevada, San Francisco, and many more. The layout of towns, Spanish-style architecture, the patio, the plaza, and the rancho all survive in altered forms as elements in California's built environment. The Spanish settlers introduced European plants and animals that forever changed the flora and fauna of California. Some elements of Spanish town government and statutory law survive to this day. The lands owned by the municipalities of San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Jose are based on the generous Spanish government grants to the pueblos. The Spanish law concerning water rights as a communal rather than a private resource continues to influence California's legal history. So too does the Spanish legal doctrine of community property. Increasingly, Spanish is an important second language in California as Latinos, whose roots extend into Mexico and Latin America, continue with a second chapter in the Spanish colonization project. The language spoken by Father Serra, the Presidio soldiers, settlers, and many mission Indians can be heard in the streets and fields of California in the 21st century. Thus, the profound changes that began in 1769 continue to echo into the present.